That was stunning, absolutely looked gorgeous and wonderful and was so well made. And we're so lucky to welcome Jess and Haris onto our Q&A stage for the BSc. So please welcome Jess Hall and Haris Zambarloukos.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming on a Monday night. This is a great turnout. And welcome Jess.
Thank you.
Huge congratulations.
Thank
I mean,
you.
it's a stunning film and a really moving film. It's so rare that you get a film about the human condition that's kind of set in a way that allows filmmaking to really kind of play a big part. So the story for me and the filmmaking was so intertwined, and it was just inspirational. An inspirational story, inspirationally made. And I think he deserves a great big round of applause.
Thanks. I mean, I think I have to start by sort of acknowledging Stephen Williams, the director, because obviously, as you know, and as everybody here knows, you know, that is a huge part of being able to really integrate the filmmaking with the story. And it's a great story, and I knew it was a great story. And I think I knew that Stephen and I would be able to collaborate in that way, and it was just a real pleasure to really discover that during the filming and to have his full support to kind of go as far as I did with, you know, with really tying that filmmaking, those decisions into the storytelling.
Well, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you met Stephen and how the whole project came about for you?
Yeah.
Good place to start.
So, I mean, interestingly, I was actually in Prague, which is where we shot the film, which is sort of bizarre, in the middle of a pandemic. And I got the script, and I was sitting in my hotel room because it was lockdown, so I immediately sort of opened it up and started reading it. And obviously, the opening just kind of slapped me in the face. I mean, it was one of the best openings to a screenplay I've ever read. And certainly for me personally, probably the one which really made me, I just had to do this film. I just knew when I'd read that scene that I really wanted to do it. So I sort of immediately sent a message to my agent saying, you finally found something that actually, you know, connects with me on a personal level. And when can I talk to Stephen? And so, you know, I did a Skype a couple of nights later with Stephen from the hotel room. And you know, I mean, Stephen and I both have Jamaican heritage, and I think Stephen didn't believe that I had Jamaican heritage when I first told him. So he gave me a funny look when I said that, but then we got talking, and we just realized we had a lot in common. I mean, he'd actually gone to school in England, so he'd had this kind of, this cultural, you know, cross experience, which was not like me, but was very similar to my father. So I'd grown up with, you know, the stories of my dad coming from Jamaica and going to school in England, and Stephen had had a very similar experience, and also that obviously connects to the story of Chevalier, who, you know, came from the Caribbean to go to school in Europe. So I think there was just such a cross-fertilization. We had a producer on the call, Rachel, and, you know, we just got going, and she was just smiling because, you know, we were spiraling into, you know, all sorts of stuff. And really just made a very good connection, and I think I got the note immediately back, you know, that it was going to happen, and you know, we were just off straight away. So it was one of those connections, and I'm sure you've had them. I think they're quite rare, probably, but it went on like that as well. So we became great collaborators, and I think Stephen brought me in a way in which probably no director has ever brought me in terms of, you know, making me a co-author of the film in many ways, acknowledging really the role that I could bring to it on many levels. So that was a very enriching experience, and I think, you know, you see the results of that in terms of the cinematography and a lot of the other aspects of the production as well.
Well, for most of, some of you that knows, but Jess and I have been friends for 30 years, more than 30 years, and film school friends, and Jess has always had the most painterly approach to cinematography as long as I can remember, and a fantastic love and appreciation for music. So for me watching this and knowing Jess, it's obvious how that fantastic marriage could finally happen of two of your great talents.
Thank you.
How did you go about that marriage of music and this painterly approach for this film?
Yeah, so I mean, it happened on many levels. I mean, I think one interesting thing that a lot of my prep, I had my Bose noise-cancelling headphones on, and I listened to classical music like non-stop. I mean, I like classical music, but I went to a new level with classical music, and I called it the Praha playlist, which was the Prague playlist. And I still play it quite regularly, but it was a lot of different stuff. It was, Chevalier, it was Bach, it was Schubert, it was many, operas, a lot of Mozart. I knew we were going to be using that. So I had that in my ears constantly, and in a way that almost led over the images. And what I realized immediately was, and I think it's Leonard Bernstein says, music is movement. And music is movement, and it's a series of movements. It doesn't just go at one tempo, It changes and it's constantly evolving. And I think I knew that camera movement was going to be a massive part of whatever I did. So that came very early. And then while I was listening to that music, I was wandering around the Prague galleries, which they have 5 branches of the National Gallery in Prague. So a lot of paintings to look at. Not really the right paintings, to be honest, in terms of the collections. But meanwhile, I was looking at a lot of Gainsborough. Okay. Barry Lyndon was a big, obviously, touchstone for me. John Alcott's work, and so I knew that Kubrick had also looked at Gainsborough, and that work sort of really spoke to me in many levels. And there were other painters that I looked at too, Boucher and Reynolds, in particular. So yeah, I was looking at a lot of painting, listening to a lot of music, and I think I just I wanted it to be a very immersive world. I didn't want to feel any of the kind of brittleness and perhaps the distance that you can feel with a digitally generated image. So I really wanted that kind of pervasive light, that softness, and that deliberate decision making that you see in it. I mean, a painting is one person's work. I mean, I think that's the thing, they're making all the decisions. As we know, filmmaking is a deeply collaborative work. But I think I wanted that level of control on this film. I really wanted it to be an immersive experience and to not feel anything out of place. So that was part of it. I think another big part of it was working with Karen Murphy, the production designer, because partly because of, I think, COVID, she and I got to Prague quite early, and Stephen wasn't actually there yet. And she managed to talk the producers into sending us on a research trip to Paris. Actually, we were maybe going to shoot some in Paris, so we were looking at locations and doing some research. And so she and I went to Paris, and we just spent like 3 days together, like going to chateaus. We went to Versailles. We looked at the kind of all the museums, looked at a lot of artwork, and I think it really united us in terms of the real details, like what we could really put in the frame. So there was very little kind of debate about color palettes, for example. We'd be like, oh, it's the blue from that room that we went to in this chateau, And I think there was an authenticity in that, which was really important in terms of really creating that period in a believable way, especially given that we're shooting in Prague, which, architecturally is not actually a great match for Paris.
I mean, one of the things for me that I love about the film is how effortlessly it flows and how effortless it looks in both the lighting and the camera work. And then you look at it and you're like, that must have taken a lot of work. And I think it just takes a lot of work and a lot of thinking and planning and a lot of talent to make something look effortless. And some of those things maybe we can talk about. There's 185, for example. Yeah. Again, to me, a more painterly aspect ratio and not much used. You used both candlelight and soft light in a way that for me was fantastic, because it didn't necessarily always seem that it was real candlelight, because it's quite harsh and quite flickery and really staccato in a way, and that might not have fitted the mood of, but you seem to have effortlessly used the best part of things like that. I'll give another example, if you could talk about the theatre, and you mentioned this about productions. had windows, and some scenes were in daylight, which is a really unusual way of looking at a music hall. I remember when that first kind of appeared as the first scene, that's a choice, you know, and it differentiates from doing a kind of a night performance, candlelit scene. Could you talk a little bit about how those things came about?
So let's start with the aspect ratio, because I think that's a really good note. I mean, I think this, you know, both you and I are anamorphic junkies, let's say. I think we're both kind of, and when I started building the lenses for this, because it was a custom lens set, you know, Dan Sasaki, you know, he's like, but you like anamorphic. And I was like, I know I like anamorphic, but this can't be anamorphic for several reasons, for technical reasons, but also aspect ratio. You know, I'd like to have done 1:6:6, you know, to be honest. I think even better in terms of referencing those compositions that I was talking about. But that was not really a great option from, you know, for other reasons in terms of just distribution and I think what people, you know, are used to seeing. So we settled on 185, which I think actually was great. And then, so the second point was the candlelight, yeah. So the candlelight is very tricky to work with, and I think, you know, you rightly say it's ultimately a hard source, and so that's something that I learned very quickly. I mean, I probably knew that already, but obviously on a film you start testing and dealing with the things that are going to be in front of you, and I started with one candle and a camera, and you know, it was like, okay, that's kind of not that beautiful in some ways. And also, what happens if the person turns 30 degrees away from it? You know, is the light on their face going to kind of work? You know, so it's not very forgiving. You know, the work of George de la Tour. Are you familiar with that? So, I mean, he's like a sort of almost a textbook of candlelight and how it operates. So I looked at that a lot. I knew that the blocking was going to be critical, and luckily I had Stephen's collaboration to kind of work around some of those sources, because sometimes the candles were key lights. But I also knew that that had to kind of be softened, you know, and that had to, and we were going to be doing these shots of, you know, moving shots of people traveling through environments. So I had to figure out a slightly different way of doing it, and I went through a few different phases with that. But it was a combination of things. I was using a lot of like very low level fill light. So that basically softened those harsh extremities that you're talking about. And these were really like pretty big sources, a lot of helium balloons and very, very low level. But it was just enough to kind of fill in that harshness. But the candles still read a lot of the time as key lights. The lenses were very critical to that. You know, this set that I worked on with Dan Sasaki. So the lenses were, I think some people probably know a little bit about this, but they're extremely high-speed lenses. So it's T0.9 was the 50 mil, and they went to kind of a 1.2, I think. You know, so very, very little light, and that combined with the Venice camera at 2,500. Oh, that's come off. Really meant I really didn't need a lot of light at all. But I wanted to, you know, like to get that kind of softness, and that was also the atmosphere. A little bit of atmosphere, the soft light from the big sources, the candle light's very carefully placed, and then being able to shoot at that wide iris. I mean, it just was sort of, when you first looked at it, it was kind of like nothing I'd really seen before. You know, there were lower contrast lens as well, I think intentionally, which helped. So that was all part of that look, and the other really key part of that look was practically sort of executing this moving camera, you know, at that iris, which, as you know, you know, I would right now have one eyeball in focus and the other one would be out, and then trying to move a steady cam, you know, and create this camera movement was just not going to happen. So we had to, effectively, we kind of cheated the perception of depth of field by lowering the sort of the overall sharpness of the lens. So the extreme between in focus and out of focus was reduced. So you have a kind of greater perceived depth of field. And because of that, we were able to actually, like, I mean, to you, I would imagine it doesn't feel like a film that's shot at T1 on a large format camera.
That's exactly what I was going to say. And one of the things that I've noticed in modern films that are shot at those kind of extreme f-stops is that you never know which eye to focus on, and I never felt that here. Never.
And that is a look that I think we've all sort of known to appreciate and we've seen, and that definitely wasn't the look, and it's not the look of those paintings either.
No.
So, you know, that wasn't the look I was after, and so that was kind of really something that Dan really helped me with. But it basically made, you know, the shooting possible, and it meant we could work at, I mean, a lot of that film is shot on, you know, T1, T0.9, T1.1 with a Steadicam.
What kind of focal lengths though as well? Did
Yeah,
that help?
like a 35, 40, 28,
Yeah.
and a 50 with a key focal lengths. So, you know, not long lenses, but long lenses at
Enough.
T1.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that was the key to really actually the look of the film, I think, in many ways, because I think it's a combination of the moving camera and the lighting, you know.
Well, it's fantastic, and I think also one of the things that you achieved with this that is very painterly is that by being in those low light, but at such high fidelity, because paintings don't have grain.
Yeah.
They don't ever, you know, and it becomes very, very immersive. I mean, you mentioned Georges de Latour. He, you know, his angles were very one perspective.
Yeah.
Like the light would be there. You'd have to. You could tell that the kind of model was clocked a certain way that caught, and that doesn't work with a moving picture.
No, yeah, exactly. It's almost an example of what you know you can't do.
Yeah.
So yeah, and you know that was how we worked. I mean, we had, you know, a lot of support from the production designer, you know, in terms of, you know, positioning these candelabras and you know, the theatre, for example, the Estate Theatre where we shot the opening scene. You know, I would have these big candelabras, they'd be on the theatre rig so they could come up and down, and then, you know, the helium balloons, you know, filling in, and, you know, it sort of created a kind of environmental lighting that just felt like very real. It felt like you were there, but it also felt kind of like a painting, and that was sort of what I wanted. So yeah.
Could you talk? I'd love to hear a bit more about conceptually and what happened for the opening sequence, and how you came, because it is an astonishing kind of, it's a great opener, and I remember a friend of mine used to say that the beginning of every film should be pregnant with the end, and you certainly achieved that in this. It just,
I think that's a great point. I mean, the opening to me was a microcosm of the entire movie, you know, essentially. I mean, it does sort of contain all the elements that are in the rest of the film. And like I've mentioned, it kind of struck me from the beginning. It was hugely challenging. We had Calvin was a violin player as a child, and his dad is a jazz musician. So he was, you know, a great piece of casting. He did a lot of work on the violin. We had all sorts of plans for VFX, deep fake. We had a double. About half, Calvin was doing 7 hours a day, or 3 hours fencing and 4 hours violin a day. At some point, Stephen Williams looked at me and he said, "We're not using the double." And I was like, "You're kidding me?
Wow.
We're not going to use the double?" He's like, "No, I don't want to use the double. I want Calvin. I want it all to be Calvin." So every shot is Calvin. So, you know, that in itself was a challenge. The Estate Theatre where we shot, that theatre is the actual theatre where Mozart premiered Don Giovanni. So we had kind of the weight of history on our shoulders in more than one respect, you know. But yeah, it was just logistically very difficult. We had a number of other things to do in that theatre, but the opening scene, you know, was originally going to be 2 days, and, you know, like all films, we had limits, and at a certain point it became 1 day. And at that point I just thought, can we really do this scene in 1 day? But we did.
And did you use more than one camera? Did you have did you
we
do any
used
splinter
one
work?
camera from the point at which you know, Chevalier walks on stage and the opening Mozart until, you know, the end of that scene. So you know, it was nerve-wracking. I knew the film wouldn't work unless that scene worked. So there's an immense amount of pressure, but it also, like, everyone just was so 100% committed to it. I have to mention the camera operator, Jeff Haley, who's a huge part of that, because he was a concert cellist as a child. And I discovered that when I was sort of scouting for camera operators. And I just was like, okay, well, this is meant to be. Stephen, when he heard that, he immediately invited Jeff to come and hear one of the pre-records of the soundtrack, because we had some of the tracks Michael Abels had written before we even started pre-production. So there's some pre-recording going on. So Jeff was kind of seduced in the recording studio. And got on board, and having the timing and the understanding that he had of music really was a massive contribution, and also being able to work off the Steadicam. I mean, I think if you look at that scene, you would probably look at it and know a lot of it's Steadicam, but I think the quality of the camera movement is really excellent, and there's a weight to the movement, there's a deliberateness to it that's not floating. And it's because he understands the tempos and he understands what's coming, in a way in which that really intricate knowledge of the music. So Jeff and I were able to have a really great rapport about, camera movement and really, every scene really we'd approach and talk about tempo, and he brought a great amount to that.
Well, in all of that great camera movement too, though, what you achieved in the lighting is incredible, because it never, in all that movement, it felt painterly throughout. Sometimes with long continuous shots, you feel like, oh, there's a lull there, or there's a kind of a place where it gets a little too flat or a little too dark, or but it again, effortless throughout.
I had a plan that I was going to use a lot of dimmers on that, and I was going to kind of crossfade, using crossfading the fill light and stuff to add some shape. And I soon realised that, immediately realised that was just going to not work. So I had to find other ways of doing it. But yeah, that was the big challenge really. It was, how do you maintain shape and quality of light when you're moving the camera, 200, 270, sometimes 360 degrees. And once Kelvin really let go on that performance, you're looking everywhere. I mean, and you were looking up 5 tiers of crowd as well. So yeah, it needed to have that spontaneity. I don't think, the temptation often is to control, and and I think really I knew that I had to kind of liberate the performers and liberate the camera operating, to really get what we needed out of that scene. So that's what I did.
Well, would you say that if there was one thing from this that was your biggest challenge and maybe what you learned the most, what would that be from this film?
It's a really interesting and difficult question.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, I think process is something that's always really interested me. I think the sort of, all the sum of all the parts kind of connecting. And I think, that's a very hard thing to align. A combination of, the prep that you do on a script, the prep that you do, in terms of blocking, the amount of time investment you put into lighting tests, into planning and all of those things. And you can do all that, and certainly we do all that. Yeah. But I think the bottom line is instinct, I mean, I wish I could tell you there's a formula to that, but I think what really helped me through it was kind of knowing what I wanted to do, like quite deep, inside, and actually kind of returning to that. I mean, that's what informed my decision-making more than anything else. So I think it's like, trust your instincts, do the work and then trust your instincts.
That's the feeling I got, Jess. Sometimes, I mean, I see so much of you in this, and sometimes that comes through probably surrendering to a script and a story rather than imposing yourself. And then actually, your brightest colours almost come out from that surrender rather than the imposition. And it really felt here. And I think that's the kind of, that's the connection that you give to the audience.
Well, that's great. I'm really pleased to hear you say that.
Sony Venice. Can we talk a little bit about kind of settings for that as well that got you that painfully?
It was the first version of the Venice, so the two hadn't come out yet. And I tested, Alexa and Venice side by side. What I noticed because obviously you're dealing with a lot of underexposure, regardless of, you know, I definitely didn't want this to be a very dark film. I wanted it to be darkness, but I wanted to really see the faces, you know. I mean, it was all about kind of his face in a way. So, you know, the quality of skin was really important. And I just saw a kind of amount of colour in the underexposure. Plus, I think the ASA could go a bit further at the time than the LF, which was what I was looking at it against. So it kind of gave me a bit more light, and it gave me a bit more colour. And I thought those things were kind of valuable. So I kind of went into that camera having not really shot it much. Actually, interestingly, Jeff was a huge fan of it, Jeff Haley, the camera operator, and he liked the weight of it. Because he said, I don't like a light camera on the Steadicam. He wanted the weight, you know, so he was delighted when I had the heavier camera and not a Mini or something. But essentially, it was really just a side-by-side test with a prototype lens, which pushed me towards it. And then, you know, it was one LUT. I didn't do anything that fancy in terms of the LUT, and I stuck with that pretty much throughout the color timing. I shot at the maximum resolution I could shoot at for 185, and you know, so it was pretty simple really. But that camera, I think, was the right choice. There was something interesting about, I was always a bit scared of too much resolution. You know, I think those of us who've come up with celluloid, you know, we are a little bit fearful of that. But I think you said something earlier about a different kind of a quality, a different kind of a painterly quality, and I suppose, you know, there's something sort of magical that happens when you combine old and new technology, digital and analog, right? There's a kind of exchange that goes on there that's quite sort of alchemy in a way. And it's sort of what you're missing from photochemical, you know, from the photochemical process. You somehow, so I think there was a bit of that going on between the Venice and the lenses, that it was like this very high resolution camera with a lot of color information, and then these lenses that were just kind of butting up against it, you know, and that tension felt like there was a kind of modernity in the image that was sort of exciting. It wasn't just a perfect period recreation. It was sort of more than that. And that's, I think, what was sort of exciting about that combination of that prototype lens and the Venice that really led me to that camera.
And did you use your light meter, your eye, the monitor? How did you go about gauging what you felt was right for a scene once you had all your planning and you were there?
Yeah, I did go to the light meter. I went to foot candle mode because it was off the scale, even on the Spectra most of the time. And I think we were getting into sub 1 foot candle a lot of the time. There was one moment where, because, you know, we couldn't use a ton of candles in some of these locations. I mean, a lot of Prague is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and actually, when I first went into the Estate Theatre, they said no candles. So there were instances where I couldn't use as much candlelight as I liked, and, you know, I was right on the edge of even getting exposure with those lenses. So I did go into foot candle mode, and I'd set like fill light, you know, to that quite a lot, because, you know, when you're dealing with these big rooms, it was just a kind of a quick way to get an idea of where you were at. And then I think just using the single LUT and just having a monitor that I trusted was also like super valuable, you know. But definitely like the exposure meter, it was also just an interesting sort of science experiment with that level of light that me and my gaffer David Kritz would kind of quite enjoy, you know, looking at each other when it was just, I don't think either of us had shot in that dark environments before.
You are also a great stills photographer and use stills when you kind of, just I know for your recce's.
Yeah.
How much did you use still photography in your recce's and planning?
Actually, quite a lot, because I ended up, I think I don't know if you're still a Leica user, but I am. But I ended up getting, I bought a 28mm 1.4 Leica lens because I wanted this, you know, something that was similar-ish to the kind of levels I was going to be working at, and I just had that lens on my camera the entire pre-production. I didn't take it off. And that was great, and I shot, you know, a 1.4 at, you know, 2,500, and went around these locations and did a lot of that. So it was, yeah, it's always a big part for me. And then it was also nice on set as a tool, because I was roundabout in the zone, so for pre-lighting, you know, it was kind of quite nice if I didn't have a camera, I'd just use that lens and I'd get a nice idea of where I was at.
I think what's, just for people out there, the one good thing about that I've found, and I know we've talked about this with Jess before, is that you get your eye used to, in prep, what your camera sensitivity and lens sensitivity is.
Yeah.
So in terms of how you work light levels, and it becomes consistent.
Yeah, you're sort of tuned in,
You're
you know,
tuned
to
in,
that,
yeah.
and so that's helpful. I think the other thing that was really good for me was I'd just take them into Lightroom and I'd just look at, like, you know, colors, and I'd just be like, okay, that we need, because, you know, sometimes you couldn't change everything in a location, but, like, for example, the Estate Theatre, you know, it had these side panels that were not a great color, and when you looked at it kind of, you know, in Lightroom, you just like, okay, on a bigger screen, you know, that needs to be like the blue of the 18th century French blue, you know, that's going to be the first thing we see of Chevalier. So if you went round and you kind of looked at your camera angles and you thought about what were the most important shots, what did you want to invest in, it was helpful in that process, you know. And also looking at wide shots and thinking about where you're going to put lighting. It's very useful for that, you know, because these were big areas and we had big camera movements. So a lot of the sources were very far away, you know, so it was like, have I got enough room to kind of cram, you know, a helium balloon in that ceiling? I mean, the theatre at Český Krumlov, where the finale happens and where he does all the rehearsals for, that is a very precious theatre in and it's one of the, I think, the most intact Baroque theatres in the world, and that was very tight for space. I mean, I think you get a sense of that. Mm-hmm. It's quite a different kind of a theatre to the opening theatre.
Fantastic. Well, I don't know, Jess, should we ask some questions? Do you think? Well,
sure.
Congratulations on a true masterpiece, and this is the look I've been looking for since I saw Barry Lyndon here in 1975. And can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. I'm talking about the lenses. I had a chat with Jan Harlan about the lens that Kubrick used for Barry Lyndon.
Yeah.
And here you have the fastest lens in the West, I think, in this fabulous lens that is prototype.
Yeah.
So you're pushing the envelope, you know, into... was it possible for the first time, am I right in saying that for the first time you could use a very fast lens, which is usually very, very heavy, but they've made them actually light enough to be used on a Steadicam? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. The Steadicam was a major tool for us. So, I mean, just to backtrack, I mean, I think I mentioned, you know, the influence of Alcott's work on Barry Lyndon, so I'm glad you brought that up, because, you know, that film has just resonated with me since the first time I saw it, and it's one of the few things I projected before I started this film. So that was very much kind of hanging in the ether, you know, for me. And I think one of the things that really struck me about that film was, you know, you talk about shooting in low light and you think about darkness, but when I look at that film, the light on the faces is glowing, you know. It has an incredible quality of light to it, and that's because of the speed at which, you know, the apertures are going on those cameras. So you're actually not, it doesn't look like an underexposed film. So I think that was really interesting, and I think there were several things about the technology of filmmaking that made this a really interesting, you know, premise, if you like. One of them was you know, the collaboration that I built with Dan Sasaki at Panavision, the lens designer, because I felt like we'd done a couple of projects together, and I think we kind of understood each other quite well, and I felt this was a big ask, you know, but I felt I could give it a go. So yeah, his participation was huge. I think, you know, a camera digital film camera that works at 2,500 ASA, as well as the Venice works at, I mean, I think that's kind of was a bit of a breakthrough.
It's huge.
So it was a combination of being able to combine the lenses, you know, and like you said, lightweight enough lens, because it is a large format lens as well.
Oh, yes.
You know, with this Venice camera, that made it a really interesting kind of revisiting of that question that Kubrick was asking, you know. And so I think, you know, hopefully the films are kind of having a bit of a conversation, or my film's having a bit of a conversation with that, because I certainly wouldn't have done what I did if I hadn't been such a fan of that film.
Which is a true wonder.
Yeah, it
It really
is.
is. And digital cinematography has come of age now, I think, with this.
Yeah,
It's
well, I'm
definitely,
glad you feel
you know.
that. Yeah, I think we've all been waiting to find that special combination, you know,
As good as
where we
70
stop
or-
imitating film and we're
Yeah.
doing something that's distinctly
Yeah.
something that the digital technology can do,
Yeah.
but it has a quality that as artists we actually can connect to and that connects with an
And
audience.
with the painterly bit.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, and I think this was my first comment to Jess, every frame looks like a painting, and not
Yes.
just any painting, an oil painting.
Right.
Because it really...
That's
and visceral.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, because I think...
Tactile almost.
Yes, when you go into really beautiful lighting and composition, you can sometimes feel removed, and I never ever felt that on this film. So I think that human connectivity that you achieved is the greatest achievement.
That's
I
it.
think.
Well, I think for the story, that's sort of the most important thing, right? So it could never just be a style piece, you know. I think that would never have worked, and so I suppose that is the key, really. It's like it is a film, a deeply human story, you know, and that connection is vital. So, you know, I think that it was never going to be over manicured, you know, in that way. That was important. It had to have that visceral quality, you know.
I think sometimes one of the things that gets you into that is really bad use of background artists and overuse of background artists. And I think one of the things that you definitely did on this film, together with Stephen and probably your AD as well, I would imagine, is you kept that enough there for the information and completely let the performance be at the forefront. And it did not look like you lacked background, for example, but that it was so carefully and meticulously placed that it never interfered with the kind of the story and the performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is credit to, you know, to Richard Fox, the AD, and Stephen. I think Stephen, you know, he's got a great feeling for movement and a great feeling for blocking, and I think that, you know, he brought a lot to that, and Richard just, you know, it wasn't a big film, it wasn't a small film, but, you know, on every film, it's hard to get enough people in the background. So, you know, we did what we could, and I think they did a great job, and also brought some interesting movement as well into the scenes, you know. So,
Question. Oh. And then Nick, I think.
Thank you. What a beautiful film. I'm really. I have so many questions, but I just wanted to ask one in particular. I just really loved all the dynamic transitions, particularly lighting transitions between scenes. Just wondered if you had any little secret kind of little cheeky things you can tell us about your filtration or grading process in terms of particularly transitions. And
right, yeah, grading in terms of transitions, that's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, they were well planned. I think that's one of the key tricks. So I sort of knew where I was going and I knew where I had to get to. You know, some of them are like almost like hard matches. So, you know, when you come, the final sequence where they're sort of falling in love and you kind of come into the opera and you sort of go around her and you go to this baritone and he delivers a line and then you go on to Chevalier and he's in the middle composing. You hit the score and then it match cuts to the score in his apartment. So that, for example, was just an absolute lighting match. You know, to blend it, it had to really just 100% match, and that was a fairly, in a way, the simpler task. I think where I got into trouble was, for example, with the fabric. There's a shot that transitions on fabric, and I think for some reason, and this is quite interesting actually, because I think I had an LED light box in the set, and the color spectrum of the LED read quite different to the candlelight. So when I then went onto stage and had the same fabric in candlelight, it looked orange compared to green. And I was like, hold on a minute, you've got the wrong fabric. And they were like, no, this is the right fabric. So that was one I had to kind of fix in color correction. I did colour correction with Ivan Lucas, who you might want to look him up. He played an important part. He's a very, very good colorist. And I think also that I was talking about just using one LUT as well, which I think, you know, I mean, people have their own techniques. I've done, I mean, I think one division, I think we had 21 LUTs. You know, it's horses for courses, you know. But on this, for example, I think that critical control, you know, when you've got just one LUT, you're working with one film emulsion, if you like. You know it inside out, you know. And so kind of doing lighting, you know, subtle lighting transitions and blends becomes easier. I'm trying to think of other interesting ones that might be good to talk about.
Where we transition from the scene with him and his mother, and then it goes into her in the plantation.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Candlelight effect that you did on.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that was an interesting one. You know, we shot the scene with the mother. We shot quite early, I think, and that was completely firelit. So that was you know, that sort of dictated then what had to be done on the face in the mirror, because and we'd already shot that. So yeah, so and I think, you know, the interesting thing about the transitions was because we had some of the score already, we were actually able to time those out with the music, which was really fun. So that sort of montage sequence, the shots were actually choreographed to literally sort of land on a note. And that was where the transition was going to happen, and we knew that. And again, I mean, I have to mention Stephen because, I mean, I don't know if anyone's seen his Watchmen episode. He's quite well known for it, but I mean, he is very, very good at transitions. So he brought a lot creatively to that, and a real meticulousness to it. And again, Jeff, with the Steadicam, being able to get to those frames, you know, so it's a real team effort. And I think we had a lot of clear targets because we knew that where they were going to happen, because we were so well prepped that, you know, there weren't really that many accidents. It was sort of like, this is where we're going, this is where we're coming from, and this is the timing. And then, you know, it all kind of happens.
Nick, you had a question? And then we'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Hey, absolutely wonderful. I have to say I couldn't hear the voices very well, but it was such a pleasure just looking at the pictures. And I'll certainly watch it all again with subtitles at home on my OLED. Yeah, I think my main question is similar. Planning, previs. How much did you get all that down and know exactly each day, or were there times you went on each morning and worked it up with the actors at the day?
So, I mean, our process was quite interesting. I mean, I don't want to misrepresent, but from what I remember, Stephen at one point said, I don't do storyboards. I certainly never saw a storyboard on this film. So it was, in a sense, very sort of about discovery in many ways. I think, you know, looking at a scene, looking at the actors in a rehearsal, you know, it would be the first AD, Stephen, myself and the camera operator, Jeff Haley, sometimes the gaffer. We'd start every day with just a loose rehearsal. And, you know, the idea really, and I love working like this, and there's other directors that I've worked with like this, where you kind of do the moving master, you know, so you're basically, that first shot is essentially the whole scene. And what happened with us was sometimes that shot was the scene. So, you know, for example, the scene with his mother where they're sort of back and forth and she goes to the music and he walks away into the foreground. I think it's definitely like a 3-minute scene, all done on the Steadicam, all blocked out. I mean, I definitely have a real sense of where I want to put the camera in a very deliberate way. So I like to get the viewfinder and I just walk it and I just have people mark me, you know, and I'm like, this is where we need to be for this. And then when you've got a director like Stephen who actually loves to do continuous takes, you know, you've got a great collaborator there, because if you need to adjust somebody, you know, he doesn't mind doing it most of the time. So that was a lot of the process actually, and I think the great thing about having Jeff Haley operating a lot of this stuff on the Steadicam was that, you know, you could make changes. So if actors wanted to take another step or another 2 steps, you know, that really wasn't a problem. There was no dolly track. And so you could actually do this stuff quite quickly. And I did use a lot of like mobile light stuff on those shots as well. I would often have like a couple of moving handheld lights and a couple of reflectors, you know. And so, you know, there was a certain amount of freedom in that, and the rooms were very environmentally lit, with not much to look at in terms of lighting stands on the floor. So yeah, that's a really great way to work, and I think that was really the main way we worked. There were other sequences that were very, very planned, like the montage sequence that I talked about. And I'm trying to think of others. I mean, you know, for like the sword fighting, for example, I mean, there was a stunt blocking, and you know, Calvin obviously had to learn that. And you know, there were certain shots that, you know, we just wanted to do, like for example, the one sort of big biography on Chevalier is called The Sword and the Bow. And I had a sort of epiphany that I just had to have a shot that went from the bow to the sword. So the shot where he's playing in the La Boissière, and then he does that and it becomes the sword, was the kind of, you know, because apparently the two were kind of linked, you know, the articulateness he had with the bow and the skill with the sword, it was, you know, it's the arm. So it just seemed really nice to connect that. So there were some things that we were definitely aiming for, some real specifics, but generally I think there was a real competence. I had an amazing focus puller with me who was really able to adapt, someone I've worked with a lot. So that side of things was very taken care of. I didn't have to worry too much about, you know, being a bit looser with. So yeah, does that answer?
It does, yeah, and coming on to that focus stuff, it was astonishing.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing to see how focus pullers work now.
Yeah.
They're concentrating on an image rather than looking at the distance that, well, they have to do both, but
yeah.
It's that ability they have now to follow focus on the fly.
I mean, incredible skill.
Yeah.
I mean, incredible skill. And again, I mean, we talked about technology and the fact that technology has enabled this film to be made the way it was. Again, the remote focus systems, you know, the Light Ranger 2, you know, I don't think this film could have been done without the Light Ranger 2. And, you know, that system, for anyone who doesn't know, uses infrared to basically give the focus puller a kind of overlay graph of sort of where to put the focus. So, you know, they're looking at a monitor that, you know, probably has peaking up, but also that has this other graph that they work to. And I really just think Craig Grossmuller, who is the focus puller, I've worked with him for 7 or 8 years now. I think he did extraordinary work on this. And again, his work to me feels like he's entering the character of the film too. You know, it's not, because he had to make decisions, you know, and so he was part of that, and like, you know, when do I go? And he felt it really beautifully, I think. Yeah. So big contribution there, which again, you know, the technology has given us these great opportunities.
And just to add to that, I mean, a great focus, it's not a focus puller, it's a first assistant camera operator. They're operating the camera for you in that way, and they're assisting you. And one of the things that was obvious in this film, and that's why you never felt the kind of the low f-stop, in my opinion, was that transition from eye to eye was absolutely meticulous and effortless. And
it's very gifted.
And that is a human skill, not a technology skill, and a storytelling
we should give the focus puller and the operator a round of applause, I think.
Yeah, I think so, definitely.
And everybody else as well.
Yeah, and I think Haris's point is really critical there, is, you know, they have all that information, but actually, you know, the other thing is that half the time that information didn't work because the light level was so low that you know, because I said to Craig, because he was talking to them directly about recalibrating the light level to get it to a lower light level, because it was set for like around T2, I think, to optimally work. It was we were way below where it functioned best. And I thought he'd actually spoken to them and changed something. And then when I came to I asked him, I said, so what did you actually change? Because suddenly it started working. And he said, well, I basically turned it off when I wasn't, when I was like at a certain point, it just didn't work. So I just went by eye, So a lot of it is feel, So it's a combination of the two, yeah.
We had a question in the back.
Hello, I'm a student of London Film School. So, like for me, this film felt like a visual symphony, like the movements of the camera, the choreography of the camera. I know there is a lot of editing there too, but I felt like the whole visual sequences are moving like like notes of a symphony. I just wanted to know how you internalize the music into the movements of the camera.
I mean, I'm really pleased you said that. Because like I said, I was listening to symphonies the whole time I was preparing for this film. And I think one of the things I realized about a symphony is, I mean, yes, it has to change, but it also has these big movements, like the whole vocabulary of the piece changes in dramatic ways in certain times. And so, for example, the opening sequence, has a very different type of camera movement to the rest of the film. It's connected to the end sequence, but not really. It's kind of its own thing. So I think one thing that listening to all that music and the symphonies was like, okay, you've got to have change. I think there's a danger in which you build a language for a film and you get into that comfort zone and you repeat yourself. And one thing I kept saying to myself was, you've got to change. You've got to hit some different movements. And I was like, I've got to remember that movement. And it's a Schubert piece. I can't remember which one. I think it might be a 10, but it's a Schubert piece that just completely transforms in terms of its movement after an absolutely beautiful melodic opening. It's like you feel the storm clouds gather, and you're into like another world. And I was like, I want to do that with the camera movement at some point. And, I'd like to have done more of it. But I think, you do feel it in places, yeah.
I think we have to publish your playlist on the BSC website.
That's a good idea, we should.
It's like every piece that was being played, the movement kind of changed a bit, and it was not repetitive at all. So that's why I literally asked you the process of internalizing every piece that you were shooting and then internalizing it and shooting it in a very different way, and that was very beautiful to see. And it felt to the core of the heart that it's like somewhat a maestro is kind of controlling the orchestra of visual narrative.
Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, I have to say, I love the film, and it's a massive achievement. It is a masterpiece, and you should be really proud. We're all very proud of you as well for this film, and so grateful you took the time to present it to us.
Thanks. Well, thanks for doing this, Haris. Thanks to BSC, to Audra in particular, who made this happen really quick, and to Searchlight as well, who lent us the film before it's actually released, so in the UK. So yeah, pleasure to be here.